In the Paleolithic era, exchange networks were tiny, linking hundreds or at most thousands of people, most of whom lived pretty similar lifeways. In the agrarian era, they got much larger as populations grew and as the number of settlements expanded. They also got much more diverse as people began to specialize so they could bring different types of information to the exchange networks. And all of this speeded up processes of collective learning. It's not that people got smarter, it's just that there were more of them, there was more information, and over time they got better at sharing their information. Technologies of communication and transportation, once they improved, also sped up these processes. They magnified the size, the diversity, and the efficiency of networks of exchange. Improvements in technologies of communication did a lot to enhance the power of networks of information exchange. The invention of writing 5,000 years ago was particularly important because what writing did was to lock in information over many generations. Writing explains why we can still read the laws that Hammurabi issued in Babylon 4,000 years ago because he carved them in blocks of stone. More recently, the invention of paper and printing has revolutionized the storage and dissemination of information. In fact, here I am in Cheongju in South Korea, where the first book was printed using movable metal type. It was actually printed in 1377, which is 78 years before Gutenberg built his press in Europe. Improved technologies of transportation also made a huge difference. The use of horses, of oxen and camel to transport people and goods revolutionized both transportation and warfare. They also allowed pastoral nomads to settle the steppes of Eurasia, creating a huge mobile zone that ran all the way from East Asia to the Mediterranean and allowed a huge movement of people, of ideas and of goods. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, new boat-building technologies and new navigational techniques allowed people to start migrating into the Pacific Ocean until by 1,500 years ago, they had settled most of the islands of the Pacific. And finally, the great empires of Persia and China started developing road systems and courier systems, and those systems provided the most efficient ways of moving information until modern times. In Africa and Eurasia, long-distance trading systems developed. And what they did was they connected regional and local exchange networks. The first of these carried goods, people and ideas by sea from China, around India, to Africa and the Mediterranean, and backwards. The second is known as the Silk Roads. It carried goods, people and ideas by land, connecting China, Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean world. As a result of these networks, 2,000 years ago, silk was being traded all the way from China through Central Asia to Rome and Egypt. And at the same time, you could find Roman coins all the way from Britain to Vietnam. 1,000 years ago, wealthy Persian consumers could order specially designed porcelains in China and have them transported specially around India to Persia. In the 1400s, a Chinese imperial fleet went to Africa, picked up a giraffe, took it back to Beijing and presented it as a gift to the emperor. And in the same century, a Muslim traveller, Ibn Battuta, travelled all the way from Morocco to Central Asia to India, maybe onto China. And wherever he went, he encountered Muslims. As Ibn Battuta's experiences show, religions also travelled along these exchange networks. Buddhism, for example, travelled from India through Central Asia to China, Korea and Japan, while Islam travelled from Arabia through Persia to Central Asia to India and Southeast Asia. Technologies also travelled these routes. For example, East Asian techniques of printing, of gunpowder manufacture and also of paper making travelled through Central Asia to the Mediterranean and to Europe. But diseases also travelled these routes, devastating diseases. We know that 1,800 years ago, there were smallpox epidemics in Rome, and almost certainly these were transmitted through the Silk Roads. But worst of all, of course, was the Black Death in the 1400s. This seems to have travelled from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean and Europe, and wherever it arrived, it decimated populations in the great hub regions of Eurasia. But over time, what these disease exchanges also did was to strengthen immune systems, just as exchanges of ideas strengthened the technologies of the hub regions of Eurasia. But throughout the agrarian era, there was a clear limit to the size, the extent, and the power of these exchange networks. That's because the world was in effect divided into 4 great world zones, between which there was hardly any connection. It's almost as if human history had taken place on 4 separate planets. By far the largest and the oldest of these world zones was the Afro-Eurasian zone. This extended all the way from eastern Siberia to southern Africa. Within this zone, from as early as 4,000 years ago, technologies such as the domestication of animals and the use of metals diffused over wide areas. These technologies had their greatest impact in the hub zones. Those were the zones where there were large populations and very diverse connections. In the Afro-Eurasian world zone, the major hub zones were the Mediterranean and Europe, Mesopotamia and the Muslim world, northern India, and Eastern Asia. The second largest of the world zones was the American zone. This was settled from about 15,000 years ago, but within it there emerged 2 major hub zones with agriculture and agrarian civilizations in Mesoamerica and in the Andes region. These, however, had smaller populations and much smaller and less powerful networks than in Afro-Eurasia. So fewer ideas were exchanged, fewer people, fewer technologies. The third great world zone was the Australasian zone. Here, until very recently, most people, the vast majority of people, lived as foragers, except in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where there were farming communities. Now this meant that populations were tiny by Afro-Eurasian standards. Exchange networks carried limited amounts of information. But nevertheless, in some areas, innovations accrued, populations began to grow. And it's possible that some societies in this zone were heading, like the Natufians 10,000 years earlier, towards some form of agriculture. The final world zone was the Pacific. This was settled by mariners from Southeast Asia from about 3,500 years ago to form what was, at least geographically speaking, by far the largest of the world zones and by far the largest exchange network. Some of the islands, such as Tonga and Hawaii, were quite large, and they had quite large societies and chiefdoms. But on the whole, the distances between islands were so vast, populations were so small, that the exchanges of information and goods and technologies were very, very limited, much, much more limited than in the Afro-Eurasian world zone. Exchange networks seem to have worked most efficiently where populations were densest, most diverse, and most interconnected. And that meant, of course, above all, in the great hub regions of the Afro-Eurasian world zone. But even here, throughout the agrarian era, innovation and growth faced significant limits. The most critical of those limits seems to be associated with a characteristic pattern of rise and fall of populations that you see in all agrarian civilizations. Here's how it seems to have worked. You get an innovation, say irrigation. It allows populations to rise, and they may rise for several centuries. But then, as the great 19th century scholar Robert Malthus pointed out, there comes a point where populations are rising too fast. They're rising faster than innovation. And at that point, you have too many people to feed. Starvation begins to appear. Famines become more regular. Diseases begin to spread. Governments begin to fight over dwindling resources. And eventually, you face catastrophic calamities like the Black Death in the 1400s. If you look at graphs of population growth in agrarian civilizations, you can see this characteristic pattern of rise and falls that we call Malthusian cycles. You can see it over and over again. Then, quite suddenly, in recent centuries, the pattern seems to vanish. And the reason seems to be that rates of innovation increased so fast that they began to overtake rates of population growth. So here's the question. Why did this happen? Why did collective learning become so powerful in recent centuries?